Before there was ever a hum of electricity running through these hollers, there was still meat hanging in the smokehouse and milk staying sweet for days, and nobody ever went hungry because a machine broke down. My grandmother used to say that the old ones did not need a box with a motor to keep their families fed through the coldest winters and the hottest summers because they had something better. They had knowledge passed down through generations. And if you stay with me for the next few minutes, I'm going to show you 10 of those forgotten methods that kept food safe on the table long before anyone in these mountains had ever heard the word refrigerator. Up here in the mountains, life did not wait on convenience. If a family did not know how to keep their food safe, they did not eat, come January. And that was simply the truth of it. So the folks who settled these hollers and ridgelines built a way of living around the seasons and around the land itself, and every single method they used still works today if you know how to do it right. I have spent years talking with old-timers and digging through what their kin left behind. And today, I want to walk you through 10 of the ways families up here kept their food from spoiling without ever plugging anything into a wall. The first and maybe the most common method was root cellaring. Nearly every homestead in these parts had a root cellar dug right into the hillside or tucked under the porch, where the ground stayed a steady, cool temperature no matter what the weather was doing above ground. Potatoes, turnips, carrots, beets, and cabbage could sit down there for months without going soft or rotting because the earth itself acted as nature's refrigerator. The trick was airflow. Too much moisture and everything would mold. Too little and the vegetables would shrivel up like old leather. So families built their cellars with small vents near the top and bottom to keep a slow, steady breeze moving through, and they packed their root vegetables in sand or straw so the roots never touched each other and spread rot from one to the next. The second method was smoking meat, and this one is probably the most iconic image people have when they think of old Appalachian life. A smokehouse was not just a shed with some hooks in it. It was a carefully built structure where hickory or apple wood burned low and slow for days at a time, filling the meat with smoke that did two things at once. It flavored the meat, and it also pulled the moisture out, which is exactly what bacteria need to survive and multiply. Without that moisture, bacteria simply cannot take hold the way they would on fresh meat. Ham's shoulders and sides of bacon would hang for weeks, sometimes months, and a family could cut off what they needed, and the rest stayed safe, hanging right there in the smokehouse rafters. The third method families relied on heavily was salt curing, and this one worked hand in hand with smoking most of the time. Before meat ever touched smoke, it usually got packed in coarse salt for several days or even weeks, depending on the size of the cut. Salt draws water out of meat through a process called osmosis, and once that water is gone, the environment becomes downright hostile to the bacteria and mold that cause spoilage. Some families used a dry salt pack, while others made up a brine and soaked their meat right in it. Either way, the result was the same. A piece of pork that might spoil in 2 days sitting out could last through an entire winter once it had been properly salted. The fourth method was drying fruits and vegetables, and this is something that gets overlooked because it seems so simple, but it was absolutely essential to surviving the colder months. Apple slices would be strung up on thread and hung near the fireplace or laid out on screens in the sun until they turned leathery and lost nearly all their moisture. Beans were often left right on the vine until they dried out completely, which is where we get what old-timers call leather britches beans. Corn was dried on the cob and then shelled later for cornmeal that would keep for a long stretch of time. Drying works on the same basic principle as salting. Remove the water, and you remove the environment that spoilage organisms need to survive. The fifth method was fermentation, and I think this one deserves more credit than it usually gets because it is not just about preservation. It actually creates food that is healthier than what you started with. Cabbage packed tight in a crock with salt and left to sit would turn into sauerkraut over the course of several weeks as natural bacteria broke it down and created an acidic environment that harmful bacteria simply cannot survive in. The same basic idea applied to pickled cucumbers, pickled beans, and even pickled eggs in some households. The sour tang that comes from fermentation is not just flavor. It is a chemical shield that kept food safe for months at a time sitting on a shelf at room temperature. The sixth method was spring houses, and this is one that a lot of people outside these mountains have never even heard of. If a family was lucky enough to have a natural spring on their land, they would build a small stone or wood structure right over top of it, so the cold spring water ran directly through a trough inside the building. Milk, butter, and cheese could be set right in that flowing cold water, and it would stay chilled almost as well as if it had been in a modern refrigerator. Some spring houses stayed a consistent 50 degrees or cooler, no matter the season, which made them absolutely invaluable for dairy products that would otherwise spoil within hours in the summer heat. The seventh method was canning, and while this practice came a bit later in Appalachian history, once mason jars became widely available, it quickly became one of the most important tools a family had. Green beans, tomatoes, corn, peaches, and countless other fruits and vegetables would be cooked down and sealed into glass jars while still hot, which created a vacuum seal as the jar cooled. That seal kept air and bacteria out entirely, and a properly canned jar of food could sit on a pantry shelf for a year or more without spoiling. Canning days were often a community event where women from several families would gather together and spend an entire day putting up food for the winter, and it became just as much a social tradition as it was a survival necessity. The eighth method was rendering and preserving fat, and this one is easy to overlook, but it mattered a great deal. Lard rendered down from hog fat could be stored for long periods, and it was used not only for cooking but as a preservation medium itself. Meat like sausage would sometimes be packed directly into containers and covered completely in a layer of rendered fat, which sealed out air, just as effectively as a modern vacuum sealer does today. As long as that fat layer stayed intact, the meat underneath stayed protected from spoilage for a remarkably long time. The ninth method was using the natural cold of winter itself. Families living up in these mountains understood that the season would do half the work for them if they let it. Meat butchered in the late fall or early winter could simply be hung in an unheated shed or spring house, and the cold air itself would keep it from spoiling for weeks at a time. Some families even packed meat in snow when the temperatures dropped low enough, turning nature itself into a temporary freezer. This method obviously only worked seasonally, but it was reliable and it cost absolutely nothing beyond the labor of hanging or packing the meat correctly. The 10th and final method I want to share with you today was honey and sugar preservation. Fruit preserves, jams, and jellies made with a heavy amount of sugar could last far longer than fresh fruit, because sugar draws moisture out of food in much the same way salt does, and it creates an environment where mold and bacteria struggle to survive. Some families even preserved whole fruits like pears or peaches by submerging them entirely in honey, which acted as a natural antibacterial barrier. This method took more resources since sugar and honey were not always easy to come by, but when a family had access to them, it opened up a way to enjoy sweet fruit flavors well into the winter months. What strikes me most about all 10 of these methods is how little they actually relied on anything manufactured or purchased. A root cellar was dug with hand tools. A smokehouse was built from timber cut on the family's own land. Salt could be traded for, or in some cases, mined locally. These were not people waiting on a supply chain or a store shelf to keep their families fed. They understood the land they lived on, and they understood the basic chemistry of spoilage, even if they never called it chemistry at all. They just called it knowing how to keep food. And I think there is something worth sitting with in that. We live in a time now where nearly everyone depends entirely on a refrigerator humming away in the kitchen. And if the power goes out for more than a day or two, panic sets in because people no longer know these older ways. But the knowledge never actually disappeared. It just got set aside because it was not needed anymore for most folks. The families who came before us in these hills figured out how to work with nature instead of against it, and every single one of these 10 methods still works exactly the same way today, as it did 200 years ago, because the science behind them never changed. Salt still pulls moisture, smoke still preserves, cold ground still holds a steady temperature. Fermentation still creates that protective acidity. None of that depends on electricity, and none of it ever will. If you found value in learning these old ways, I would encourage you to try even just one of them for yourself. Dig a small root cellar. Try fermenting your own cabbage into sauerkraut. Learn to salt cure a piece of meat the way your great-grandparents might have. There is a quiet kind of confidence that comes from knowing you could feed your family, even if every modern convenience disappeared tomorrow, and that confidence is exactly what these mountain families carried with them every single day of their lives. Subscribe request. If this kind of forgotten mountain knowledge speaks to something in you, then this channel is exactly where you need to be. Every single week, I dig up more of these old Appalachian ways of living. The kind of hands-on knowledge that kept families fed and warm and safe long before anyone depended on a store or a power grid. Hit that subscribe button right now and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a single one of these videos. I put real time and real research into bringing you methods that actually worked for generations, not shortcuts or gimmicks. And if you stick around, this channel is going to become your home for learning how to live with the same independence and grit that built these mountains in the first place. Subscribe now, share this with someone who would appreciate these old ways, and let's keep this knowledge alive together before it disappears for good.